Hello, everyone, and welcome this week to Irenicast. Due to the events of this last week in Paris, Baghdad, and Beirut with the terror attacks, we are going to be having a discussion on that, and we're doing things a little differently. So, no intro music this week, no, usual, I'm Jeff, I'm Mona, I'm Alan. We just figure it's important to get right into this issue and have a really good conversation and as in-depth as we can possibly go with the time that we have. So I believe it was last night. Well, as you're hearing this, it was Sunday. We put out a call to some of you on Facebook to kind of give us some questions that you had regarding the issue of terror and the attacks and all that kind of stuff. And we got some response. So we kind of want to use those questions as a guide for our conversation. Those questions really hit a lot of the things that we wanted to talk about in the first place. So I think this is kind of a good place to start. But before we get to the specific questions, just a quick review. I know that Paris has kind of gotten the bulk of the media coverage, which we'll probably address in this conversation as far as terror attacks this week. And some of you may be listening and thinking, wait, Beirut and Baghdad. But there were 3 separate terrorist attacks claiming to be ISIS. One was in Beirut, and it was a bombing, 43 dead and over 250 wounded. The other was in Baghdad at a funeral, 18 dead, and I think over 41 wounded. And then obviously in Paris, at this point, it's over 120 people dead, several hundred wounded, I think at this point. The number keeps changing.
These are the 3 capitals of 3 different nations, all in the span of 24 hours. So it's a pretty big global event.
Yeah. So it's kind of a massive attack. I don't know if I haven't seen any articles on information on whether they were all planned purposely that way or they were just, I guess it really doesn't matter in the long run. So kind of with that as our base information, let's get into our first question. So the first question that we have comes from Facebook, and it's from Tommy. It's kind of a 3-parter. So I'll just do one at a time, and we'll address it that way. So first, the question is, would you condone waterboarding of 5 people if it were to prevent a terrorist attack like Paris? So first of all, I don't know. I'm just going to jump in there real quick because I can. But I think that the question itself, I think we should just boil it down to, would we condone torture as a means of preventing attacks like this? And I personally think that that's not a good idea because, first of all, torture does not bring about results. I read this amazing book a couple years ago called How to Break a Terrorist, and it talked about how they caught the main leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, not with torture, but with other alternative interrogation methods that actually created allies and bridges with people in that culture and made real steps towards creating peace and not just perpetuating war and violence. And statistically, torture does not work. You don't get good information, and the information you do get, a lot of time, it's false information and it doesn't pan out. So it's not effective. I think it probably feels good because you can react and do something physical and violent, which violence in general, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, more. But
yeah, shows like 24 Overflow, how torture gets information. People will just say anything to have torture stop. So any information that we get is totally suspect. But also, I think that some people define waterboarding as not torture. I think George W. Bush did that. Without going into too much detail, I would say just look up cases of people who have undergone waterboarding to see if it is torture, who themselves, they're not suspected of anything. There was a news reporter and a couple other people who did it. And just the psychological damage on them is just unbelievable. So not only does it's bad information, and it definitely is torture.
I would add in a collective sense that, and we're going to be talking about this a lot of what fuels terrorist ideology is the idea that the West is out to get them. And so the fact is that the United States government in particular has repeatedly tortured and detained people without trial at Gitmo, so on and so forth, plays into that narrative of fundamentalists and terrorists that the West is bad and therefore we must eliminate them and stand up to them.
And if you think Mona sounds like a flaming liberal right now, read Kafka Comes to America. It's a public defender who worked at Gitmo with the people at Gitmo. People disappear for tens of years with no charges, not even going to court. This stuff is scary and it's real. So this is not just some comment. The U.S. does that stuff.
And I'm going to go farther, and being a flaming liberal, but I'm just going to say that a nation that tortures people regularly without any sort of accountability is a nation that perpetuates terrorism itself. Like there's a really strong case to be made that the United States also commits terrorist acts. And so we, like Jeff said, we have to stop that cycle of violence somewhere and at least be blameless in our national approach, because right now we have a lot of things that we've done horrifyingly around the world. So, that has to stop somewhere. So I would say also, no, torture is not an answer. It's not even a reliable or sensible answer. But even if it was sensible, even if it did produce good information, we still should resist it, because we shouldn't. That's not what we should be about as a country. We should find a nonviolent route.
And along those lines, the second question is, if someone caught for a terrorist attack on a scale of this size, does the death penalty get enacted? And again, I would say no. First of all, I personally am against the death penalty for a lot of different reasons, but in this particular instance especially, you're, number one, like what Mona was saying, you're perpetuating their mission. Most of the people that are putting these attacks, they're going in as suicide bombers, so death is their glory, and that's probably the wrong word, but like that's part of the mission that really enhances their ideology. And secondly, why would you kill someone that has information that you can get out of without torturing them? So it doesn't mesh with me as far as that question is concerned. And
we'll be doing a future episode, I think, on the death penalty if I have my way, because I think it's a pretty pertinent thing to talk about in the future.
We can talk about torture and death penalty like further. Absolutely.
Any other quick comments on that question before we move to the third part of his question?
What I hear you guys saying is death serves the purposes of the terrorists and not ours, right?
Yes.
Ahead and after the fact.
Violence, not just death, violence, everything.
If we think about nonviolent approaches to conflict as being a modern technology in a lot of ways, like, yeah, it's got historical precedent, but like, my hope is that we're emerging into a new age of overcoming violence with peace. And to me, putting someone to death is not within that vision.
Yeah, and I've seen the rhetoric. I saw some meme on Facebook that talked about how, I'm just going to sum it up, but the meme said a lot of people are doing posts about Dr. King's quote about how darkness cannot drive out darkness and so on. And then I think the quote is, do not for 1 minute confuse light with tolerance. Tolerance and acceptance did not crush the Nazis and liberate death camps. Pure naked violence and aggression did that. But that's a short-term, narrow view of solving these problems. So yes, does violence work in the short term? It does. I mean, you're going to go in there, you're going to eradicate people, are going to feel good, we did something. But that's how we responded the first time to 9/11, and then that's how we're in this position again with ISIS. And if we respond the same way, we're going to create a new group with a new name, with another face of violence that we need to attack. And even using the idea of Nazis, like Nazis were created from World War I. Violence, it beget violence. And then we took out the Nazis, and then it created the Cold War and all the Red Scare and communism and all that kind of stuff. Like, this is just a cycle that one day we just have to say stop.
It didn't create communism, but I see.
Well, you know what I'm saying. I know it didn't create communism, but
all of this stuff is propelled forward by fear, and so I want to be really clear to say, when I say nonviolent approaches to conflict, I don't mean doing nothing. I think that's what people are afraid of. That if we don't lash out violently, the alternative is being completely passive and rolling over and letting people continue to bomb us. That's not what it is. There's a lot of other things that we can do, such as, addressing poverty and education, or boycotting, like cutting off supply lines, doing things like Anonymous is doing, cutting off communication cells. Like, a lot of times we bomb first and then kind of let those other methods trickle in, but we should absolutely save violence to the last possible thing and exhaust all other venues, if at all, so.
And the last part of this question, which for me is the issue in all of this that probably hits my heart the most, like emotionally. And this question is, with the refugees from Syria being a pipeline for terrorists, I don't like that wording, but to move into locations, do you strip Syrian refugees from coming into places? Or do you develop another solution, perhaps set up a temporary refugee camp in an isolated area, perhaps Greenland? Is it fair to jeopardize our own country by exposing ourselves to a known terrorist threat? I think
so. The point he's making, and the point that I've seen made by a lot of, especially conservatives on media, but many talking, head people, is that there were 3 people in the attack in Paris who have some sort of ties to the refugees that have come in to France. So the idea is that there are some terrorists coming in. When you see people post memes, 90% of Syrian refugees, and I don't know if this is true or not, they actually say jihadist males between this age and that age. And I think that that's just a totally made up number and it's inflammatory rhetoric. But the point is that opening up countries to refugees opens people up to the vulnerability that some refugees might not have the best intentions.
We're always vulnerable all the time. I mean, it doesn't have to do with refugee crisis. I think it's a horrible way to just lump all refugees together and further demonize them. People will get in if they want to get in.
The ties to this particular island that you mentioned, from what I've read, because I went all over to try to find like if there was any direct connection between the refugees and this attack, specifically in Paris. And the only thing that they found is a passport of someone who was a refugee near the body of one of the bombers. So there's not even any confirmation
to the body.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but like these people are just as much victims of these terrorist attacks than anyone else in the world, and to deny them any kind of refuge from the terror that we say we're so against. I don't know. The whole refugee crisis in general, maybe we should do an episode on that, but like it breaks my heart that these people who are being victimized by our enemy, we treat them as just as much of an enemy because maybe there's a couple people trickling in, but if we look at it as like a leak in a boat, even if there is like one or two terrorists that manage to fake an ID or whatever, or get in with the refugees, the gaping hole of terrorism that's sinking our boat is our foreign policy and the way we respond to situations like this. And it's just stupid and asinine to further victimize these people because someone else decided to victimize us. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
And to put it into more context, there have been attacks like this in Paris and Beirut and Baghdad happening in Syria and in these places every day for the past however many years. And they've been facing death and terror and fear. And like their whole civilization has been completely erupted and they don't know what to depend on. And people, the reality is people are not, sending in applications and then we're choosing a few and then allowing the refugees to come over to Europe or whatever. The reality is there are just boatloads of families trying to escape and they're just showing up. They're showing up in Greece. They're showing up at different places. They're risking death of their whole family drowning in the Mediterranean. And so these European countries, whether they want it or not, they are getting people who are absolutely desperate. And so when countries like the United States make the decision to bring over refugees or not, we have the luxury of denying or accepting, but these European countries don't. And so as members of the global world, let's just say it raises our risk a little bit to bring over people who are escaping war and a Holocaust of their own. That risk right now is just put on Greece and other countries in Europe very heavily. And if we're going to take refugees, perhaps that, that lightens the load, not just of the Syrian refugees, but of these countries that are having a really hard time. So all I want to say is the global immigration, especially of refugees, is such a complex and huge issue that there are no really good, easy answers, or we would have them. I think hospitality and a general move to hospitality has to be like our default, even if it's going to increase risk a little bit. I mean, like there's cases to say Western civilization itself is risky. I just read that recently on Culture Makers. Ryan Huber makes that point, is that civilization opening up space to minorities to be able to speak, our whole structure is necessarily more risky than like an autocratic authoritarian. Like we could have our own version of a Nazi regime and make it less risky for the general public of the United States. But that is not what we're about. We're about liberty and freedom and opportunity and that kind of stuff. So closing our borders to refugees only creates more terrorism and it destroys our civilization, in my opinion.
Yeah, because people respond in times of desperation. And if you can see refugees as an utter act of sanity, they're acting out of utter sanity.
Absolutely.
To flee total destruction is sane. It's a sane move. It's these people want to live. They're not committing the acts of violence. They're fleeing from the acts of violence. Like that's the most simple way to understand it. And when you have a globe where 60 million people are refugees and fleeing violence right now, we have to ask, like, what we're doing as a global community is wreaking so much violence that people cannot feasibly stay in their homes or they will die. I think looking at the refugee crisis is so, so important. And I also want to say that a lot of people, like that meme or whatever that talks about jihadism, like these are all male jihadists. Okay, so let's say that's true. Guess what the word jihad means? It means struggle against oppression. Okay. Like it depends on how you interpret that word. If you interpret it as struggle against oppression, as in Western world is trying to wipe out Islam and we have to protect it, then you're going to struggle against the West directly, politically, probably through violent means. If you think of oppression like the Nation of Islam does, when the Nation of Islam is one of the most influential Islamic groups in the U.S. and other places, as oppression is actually poverty and mass incarceration and lack of education, so on and so forth. Like if you go to the Nation of Islam website, for example, the very first banner you see is up with Jesus, down with Santa. Let's boycott Christmas because we want to get the nation to understand and wake up to issues of injustice and violence within our police forces. And so these kinds of issues. So what is the struggle of oppression? What is oppression and how does one or many people struggle against it? So refugees coming in from Syria might be struggling against the oppression of violence in their home state. So they're jihadists, but what are they saying in the fact that when they say I'm a jihadist, what do they mean by that? It doesn't just mean violence, Allah Akbar, holy war, blow people up, like the Western world has come to think of it through our media.
Yeah, and accepting refugees is an attack against terrorism, right? Yeah, that's how it needs to be framed.
Absolutely. That's a great way to word it. And I think kind of along with what we're talking about, because I think this is a good transition into the next question, is the next question comes from Ross from Facebook. It says, what do you feel the best way to discourage the xenophobia that results from terrorist attacks like this? Also, the go-to response seems to be retaliation. As followers of Christ, do you feel this is an acceptable response?
I think the first point needs to be stressed like as much as possible, and that is xenophobia, the fear of strangers, which we did an episode on before, is precisely what ISIS, the terrorists in that area of the world want. They have a very specific view of the end of the world, like an eschatology, just like we talked about before. Eschatology is like, the last things. And their eschatology is that there is no gray zone of humanity. There is no tolerance or getting along. To quote ISIL, the world has split into two encampments, one for the people of faith, the other for the people of disbelief, all in preparation for the final great war. So what they want more than anything else is for nations in the West and for Christians to look with fear at Muslims. Because every time one of our leaders says something against Muslims, every time us as individuals put some stupid thing on Facebook that says all Muslims are like this or that, we are feeding into their rhetoric. We are not just creating an avenue for more people to be drawn toward terrorism, but like when Muslims have no welcome in our place, and when Muslim leaders themselves sense that in our culture there is not a welcoming space for them, and they tell their people that, what that does is it creates this, divide between the Muslim world and the Christian world or the Western world. And that divide is all that ISIS cares about. And if we can do anything at all to tamper down our xenophobia, to humanize the Muslim families, the Muslim people, our friends around us, that right there is what prevents ISIS from getting its great war that it wants.
Well, and not only that, but there's an aspect of you're looking in the mirror. You know what I mean? Like you're putting out all this rhetoric against this group of people that are trying to destroy your way of life in a way that reflects the way that they're doing it back to you. Mm. Like it is just this, it's pretty, I don't know. I think that the whole cliche, the man in the mirror kind of thing is that's a good place to start for all of us. Like when the question talks about like, what are some ways that we can discourage the xenophobia? I think part of it is xenophobia. It's education. If there's a local mosque, go there, talk to someone, have a conversation. There's a great website called freemuslims.org where it's a group of Muslims who are against this kind of terror. Because we have to remember that in the midst of all these attacks, there are large groups of Muslims that are also protesting and against this violence just as much as anyone else. And no, every Christian will get offended if you try to lump them in with Westboro or the KKK or whatever other group that uses Christian rhetoric to pursue their violence and hate. So why do the same back to groups of Muslims who are just as decent and loving and kind and compassionate people as we are?
So far, our response to this specific question is one, point out that to discourage xenophobia after terrorist attacks like these, point out that xenophobia is exactly what these attacks want to happen. And two, point out that it's a very specific and limited group of people that carry out this terrorism. It's not done in the name of Islam or a certain country or whatever. These are just very specific and not normal.
I want to also offer that language and rhetoric is really important. It's really crucial to separate Islam from terror in the same way that we would never want someone to associate Christianity with terror, like, for example, bombing abortion clinics. Like, never. We would not want that directly associated. And so, while it's not our job to name who's a real Muslim and not a real Muslim, if we're not Muslims, right? That's only something that insiders can really discuss. However, there's a new term that's really helpful that separates the terrorist activities of groups like ISIS, ISIL, and IS, which are three groups that have used terrorist means to get their agendas across. The new word is called Daesh, and it's actually an acronym for those same groups, but it has a double entendre in that it also means something like to trample or crush down, or a bigot who imposes his view on others. And so the global media is, especially France, is calling for labeling these groups with this term because they don't get to claim the word Islamic State, for example, just point blank. And we don't have to accept the assumptions of that self-naming, that we have the right to rename them. And ISIS apparently has threatened to cut out tongues of people who've used this word because it frustrates their mission and their self-naming. So this is an example of nonviolent retaliation. We're going to label and denounce you with a new word that we're going to come up with, but that word also has a double function to separate terrorism from all of the millions and maybe billions of peaceful Muslims in the world who are also denouncing billions. Yeah. So I think that's a really good example of like when you're having these conversations, don't talk about ISIS, talk about Daesh. Like make this a common term that is used now because it disrupts the current narratives and it disrupts the current rhetoric.
Can I answer the second part to his question on a different vein? Ross also said, as followers of Christ, do you feel that vengeance or retaliation is a response that we should go with? And I just want to point out that I think grief and opposition and strength and solidarity are great responses. But as far as like retaliation and vengeance and, hey, we bombed, just heard, hey, we bombed 20 different places. The Western world just bombed all these places for ISIS. I think that vengeance itself, for me as a Christian, breaks down, especially when I read the New Testament and I hear Paul saying things like Romans 12:19, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, quoting Deuteronomy, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And so for me as a Christian, I do not trust human beings with their vengeance and their setting the world to rights. Because if I have any experience in my own life, is that when I think I am right and I come into a place to set things to right, it's going to look like me and my blind spots are going to be set up in whatever I do. So I don't trust my government. I don't trust myself with taking out an appropriate vengeance upon other people. The only person I trust with vengeance is God. Whether God's going to mete that out or not, it is totally God's prerogative to take vengeance itself. I think protection is important. I think we need to have conversations about how to stop ISIS. But as far as like retaliation and like, blood for blood, eye for eye, cheek for cheek, I think that is wrong from a Christian perspective.
It's wrong, and it actually doesn't work. It actually doesn't work.
That's what we're saying. Okay, we're saying it doesn't work, but that's not the only argument against it. I think the Christian argument for Christians is that even if it did work, it's not our place. That's God's place.
That's understandable. However, for people like me who have a pretty liberal, maybe even like post-religious perspective, like I don't believe the world's going to culminate in the judgment, the great judgment of God. That and it is really frustrating to think that people can commit acts of terror and maybe won't be judged even eternally. Like because I don't hold a strong concept of the afterlife, like we've talked about, right? That's really, really hard to wrestle with that tension. But I do want to offer this. This is a quote from a Muslim Sikh named Abdullah bin Bayah, who recently issued a fatwa against Daesh and the ISIS groups. This person said, the problem is that even if you defeat these ideas militarily by killing people, if you don't defeat the ideas intellectually, then the ideas will reemerge. Just killing the people who are saying these things and doing these things, vengeance in that way, it actually doesn't work because that stuff, those ideologies just pop up somewhere else. So let me offer this.
Yeah,
What
it
would
was
have happened?
Peter Van Buren called it whack-a-mole. It's a game.
It is like,
It's
yeah,
not actually solving anything.
exactly. You killing people. The ideas are much, much, much stronger than the fickle lives of individuals or even groups of people. So I just want to offer, like, for example, what would have happened if we would have said after 9/11, hey, the vengeance that we justly want can be much more effective if we get the entire nation within 10 years on clean energy and stop piping money for oil into the Middle East, thereby cutting economic power off from groups that would fund and buy weapons with that money that we're basically sending to them by purchasing Middle Eastern oil. For example, we would have created jobs, we would have created infrastructure, we would have started to eradicate poverty, we would have helped the earth, and we wouldn't have spent trillions of dollars in war money, and we wouldn't have had all these veterans coming home with PTSD for killing people with drones. Like
So
that
what
vengeance,
you're saying is
I'm saying vengeance
doubling
doesn't
down.
have to be violent.
You're saying doubling down on what we believe in, and that is civilization and things that build up the community instead of the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Instead of responding to evil with evil.
And you can't militaristically defeat an ideology. Like the war on terror is a ridiculous idea. It actually, you cannot wage a material war of flesh and blood against an idea like terror. It doesn't work.
But you can wage an ideological war, and that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Then through economics, through opportunity, through combating poverty and like world evils like pollution and things that destroy communities, you know? Mark Juergensmeyer, who is a sociologist at UCSB and a terror expert on terrorism, said that, like, for example, when the U.S. was working with members of Al-Qaeda, by offering economic incentive and opportunity and alternative ways of being and living in the world that created prosperity, they're actually able to lure people out of Al-Qaeda peacefully. Kind of what you were saying, like, I think you were saying, Jeff, that instead of torture, other stuff works better, like creating allyships and relationships and offering a different narrative. Because, like, what's more strong than someone who's been told their entire lives that the Western world wants to kill them and hates them, than making a friend in the Western world who doesn't want to kill and hate them?
Rather than making them scared of the sky because there's drones flying around that might kill them at any moment, building friendships is what brings people out of terrorism. Absolutely.
It's the only way to overcome it and to stop the cycle of violence. So
we have another question. Alan, it was put on your Facebook page. You want to read it? I think it's from Adam. Adam Leverage, one of our former guest co-hosts. So go ahead, Alan.
Of our correspondents. Okay, Adam said, his first question, what are the costs of nonviolent response? And I just want to respond saying, like, I'm always asking myself this question, like, what will it cost me to respond nonviolently? I always jump immediately to the opposite and say, what are the costs of violence itself? You know, like, sometimes it's a comparative cost. I will not deny that it is hard to respond to terrorism because terrorism is a freaking hard thing. It's horrible, and any reaction we have is going to be tough, you know? And I think that for me, a nonviolent response and a violent one are just comparing what their costs are helps me answer that question a little bit easier. So I think risk and vulnerability are easier for me as a personality. I'm not saying works for everybody. For my personality, nonviolence has less of a cost than having to go bomb people, having to react in a violent way.
I think the major cost is immediate gratification, which I think in our American society is the most costly thing that we have, because we just there's no sense in the rhetoric or in any people in power of this idea of a long game, like of actual getting to this place. So to me, that's the biggest cost, and that's a cost that so far I have not seen us as a culture be willing to even come close to making.
Which is so ironic, because if you think violence is the quick payoff, we just had a long, protracted war that cost us trillions of dollars, right? That ended up being the long game, and it's been a horrible one. Yeah. So it may look like it's immediately gratifying to bomb a city, but in the long run, it ends up being the most costly and protracted one.
I think also that the ethics of saying what costs more or what costs less is problematic. And I like the question. I like the question, and I think these conversations around costs are important, but ultimately our decision shouldn't be on what's the most or least costly. I mean, yes, the costs of violence, like immediately when I heard that question, I think of like all of the veterans coming home, like I said, who have blown up people with drones or who have assisted in that, and haven't actually had face-to-face combat. But we don't even know the psychological damage yet that we're causing veterans to be inflicted with. We don't even know, like, historically what that does to a person's psyche. But I'm thinking specifically of the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his work Ethics. This is a collection of essays that was found, like, hidden in a stairwell after Bonhoeffer was interned in a Nazi concentration camp in World War II for trying to assassinate Hitler. So Bonhoeffer is like a radical pacifist who's done a lot of ethical work around what violence is and what it means. And he says, basically, there's almost no ethical basis for taking a human life, because human life is not a means or an ends, but human life is the ends and the means. And the fact that Jesus came in human form, he says, causes like our humanity and life to be the anchor of all of reality, like through our understanding of who Jesus was. So taking a life is not an option in a lot of senses. I mean, this gets really complicated because he had to wrestle with the fact of the question of like whether it's just to kill Hitler, to kill someone who's killing many people. So I recommend his book Ethics, but I think this idea of humans being both the means and the end, that we can't put a price on human life, you know?
Yeah, and I think that Bonhoeffer's a great example of how difficult this is, and that there is a cost of work that's put into this idea of peacemaking. Because, you know, you can look at Bonhoeffer and say, well, he was a hypocrite. He said all this stuff, but then involved in an assassination plot. But when faced with evil, we're not saying it's this easy choice to say you're not going to feel like you want to do something or take care of it in this way. And I think that highlights the importance of how much harder we should work to create peace, because it is, I don't know if we can call it a default or what, but it is a drive to want to just take care of that. You know, I don't know how many times I've envisioned, you know, punching someone in the face for harm, because then the rhetoric of like family comes in. Well, if they were going to come in and hurt your family, what would you do? Well, I would hope that I would not act violently, but I can't promise that. But it doesn't mean I didn't not want to do that. You know,
but we have to embody overcoming violence in our peacemaking. Like, peacemaking is active.
I have to point out that I have seen pictures being circulated of these ISIS fighters saying, we're going to come to your country or whatever. And then, no joke, people have paired that up with an image of American History X, a white supremacist with his arms fully outstretched, Edward Norton, with a Nazi swastika on his chest saying, like, we're waiting. And I've seen... our violence...
freaking gross.
I know, but it actually is an amazing illustration of how we already have xenophobia and fear of the other. We are already angry at people that are different than us, even if we don't realize it. And this is just the cathartic moment where we can enact that hatred and that anger and that like retaliation spirit that is already in us on our enemies. So it's waiting. Our neo-Nazism has its arms wide open, and we're just waiting for the appropriate, for someone to greenlight our ability to cathartically enact all of that violence. So it's a lot more deep if you look at it from a psychological perspective.
Anyway. The question goes down to in this question, like vengeance and retaliation.
Yeah. Do
we want to blow up the world or not? Like that is the overwhelming question to me. Yeah. Like for the superpowers in the world who actually have the ability to blow up the whole freaking world, like, do we want to do that or not? And the question always has to be no. So we have to look for other ways.
So second part to his question, how do we react in ways that both engage the pain and suffering of the victims while acknowledging the imago Dei, that's the image of God, in even those branded our enemies? So Adam's asking, how do we actually give people the space to grieve and engage their pain and suffering, like people, victims in Beirut, Baghdad, and Paris, while also affirming God's image even in our enemies? That's a hard tension, because to grieve with people who are grieving, you want to hate what happened to them and the people that did it to them, right? You want to be able to look at those people and say they are just evil to the core, they're enemies. So how do you balance those two things is what Adam asks.
Man,
I think for me, really helpful. I know that's a hard question, and I don't know how to answer it personally. Daniel Kirk from Story Theology, he's a New Testament scholar. He was wrestling with this exact question, and he pointed to Matthew 5 when Jesus talks about loving your enemies. You know, it's no credit to you to love people that love you, but to love people that hate you and persecute you, that is like where true religion happens. So when Daniel Kirk sees the things that say pray for Paris and the memes that say let's pray for Paris, for him, it's a reminder that he's not just called by Jesus to pray for Paris and the people, our oldest ally, but also for the people that are doing this violence and for the situations that they're in and for the change and reconciliation and forgiveness and the, honestly, like the hard, miraculous work of those people in those situations, the enemies being changed by God and by the rest of humanity. Anyway, to pray for enemies and people that are grieving sounds ridiculous, right? Like if you went online and just put like, I'm going to pray for the ISIL, like people would think that you're nuts.
Well, part of the problem is the word enemy. Like it automatically denotes this idea of this person, everything about them, 100% is against what I am. And we have to remember that a lot of the people that are enacting these acts of terror are victims themselves. They're young men who have been manipulated because of their situation, because of violence that has been put on them or their family. And I think that if we talk about changing this idea and how do we have compassion in those situations, I think it's all these things that we've been talking about, creating a long game for peace and doing all this kind of stuff, so that if we have a structure in place that allows us to differentiate someone who we would consider like pure evil, as opposed to this is someone acting out in a way that that their culture has only told them this is the only way that you can respond to a situation of oppression, jihad, like what Mona was mentioning earlier. And I hate when people use the rhetoric of, well, that's just justifying their action. No, it's acknowledging the reason they did that action and solving that so that action doesn't occur anymore on a wide basis.
You bring up a point that needs to be like, it's important to remember that it is true. There are young men who are disenfranchised that are becoming terrorists for ISIS. I'll put a link to an article of people who have talked to, there's only a few captured ISIS members that we have at the moment, but being able to talk to them and figure out who they are not what we might think they are. But on the other side of that, terrorists like this define themselves as 100% against the innocents that they're killing. 100% against other people and their way of life. And so when we say that they, as a human being, are not like that, our story comes up against their story, even for themselves, right? Because like we don't believe that they're 100% evil or just 100% against us or against humanity in general. But for them, like that is their vision of what their religion and personhood is 100%, to the point where they love death in the service of killing us more than we love our own lives. So that's their story themselves.
And I think like the question of Imago Dei ought to cause us to radically humanize our enemy. Imago Dei, for those of you who don't know or remember, means image of God. It's a really long-standing source of Christian theology that says every human has the image of God or the imprint of God within them or without them, or involved in their createdness as just part of what it means to be sacred and human. And so I think for me, like thinking about humanizing the enemy, what Jesus was saying, loving your enemy, what you guys are saying, thinking about even how humanizing the enemy differently from the way that they even dehumanize themselves through violence and through flattening their human experiences, just seeing themselves as like fuel for the fodder, like just their lives are worth so little in this world that they can just take it and go into the next world in glory because terror is their only option, or they've been told terror is their only option. I think it's really important for us to get away from these comic book notions of evil, that there's just this evil people out there who just want to kill us. Absolutely. And it's just this flat, simplistic, like cartoonish way of thinking about an ISIS fighter.
Cartoonish in the sense that there are a lot of tropes in cartoons, like ways of doing things where all the enemies will have their covered faces. They'll have different, colors, like there'll be a green skin and they'll be
not so much visually. I mean, the characterization of like someone's intentions of like just out of a vacuum, someone just decides to be evil and blow up other people. It doesn't happen that way in real life. People get disenfranchised for very specific, historically contextual reasons. And if you actually read the story of like, for example, US and British colonialism and interventionism in the Middle East, like we were alluding to earlier, and how dismantled a lot of Islamic countries have become, and how political events and confluence of events have caused horrific human suffering and poverty and non-options and non-participation in global society and global economies. Like fundamentalism as a response to that disenfranchisement actually makes sense. So read about it. I'm not saying I validate it or I think it's good, but I think we need to educate ourselves to understand the history of how we've created this perfect storm that has actually, like, as a global community, created a perfect storm that causes terrorism to fester. Like getting at the root of the problems, humanizing the enemy, looking at the conditions that they have to survive that cause them to become terrorists is actually, to me, like a really strong understanding of Imago Dei and trying to get at the root of those causes.
Can I answer his last question with something that's going to highlight the difference between what Mona said earlier and what I believe? This might shift gears a tiny bit, but the last part of Adam's question is, what are the questions that lead to deeper understandings and peace that we could ask? And I have a different take on faith and violence. You said that sometimes, you're not sure about the afterlife. It's not a huge part of your construction of your faith. This last Sunday, I preached a sermon about how our faith should be shaped by the future. And I have a crazy thought. I think, for me personally, it is only possible looking forward and looking into a future that has been promised by God of justice, where justice, peace, forgiveness, and mercy are the norm. There is an eternity in God because God is eternal and somehow we're going to exist in that. Only from that perspective can I say violence is not normal. Because if you look in the past and you look through our human evolution, or even evolution in general, survival of the fittest, eat or be eaten, and then human history in specific has a lot of violence, wars, people fighting and attacking, tribalism. That is kind of our story. That is what we have come from. And if we're going to ask the question, what's normal? Some people are right. Violence looks normal. There's always going to be people who hate me. There's always going to be people trying to take what I have, and I must counteract that with violence. But as a person of faith, I look forward to the apocalyptic vision of, the Jewish writers of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian writers of the New Testament, that someday violence will not be normal. Whether it's on this planet or whether the whole universe, dies a heat death millions of years from now and God has to resurrect some sort of thing. I'm not trying to determine exactly how it's all going to look, but I do believe and affirm that one day justice and peace will reign with God. And so we can look back from eternity and say violence was weird. Violence wasn't normal. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think about the story of Jesus, whether you believe in a historical Jesus, whether you believe in the symbol of Jesus, whether you don't believe in Jesus. The idea of Jesus being killed by the government at large in his day because he talked about peace in the midst of violence, and he talked about getting rid of hypocrisy, and he talked about living justly and taking care of the poor, and was killed as a result of that radical message. Or whether you believe in a more mystical understanding of Christ, that Jesus came from heaven to take all sin and violence and suffering on himself, take it into hell and leave it there so that we could escape from it and we could escape from these awful patterns of violence. Like, whatever your conception of Jesus is, there's something in that story of overcoming violence with peace and love that is not flaccid. It's not weak. It's it's not a passive understanding. It's a really active, in your face, go out and get somebody from the brink of their own corruption kind of understanding of Christianity. And so looking at a future story that enacts what Jesus tried to start is really interesting. Even if you're not a Christian, I think you can use Muhammad or Gandhi is also as examples of this. Like, even Muhammad used a lot of political technologies that try to bring civilization and order into a world of chaos. Like, if you read these stories like that, trying to get at a better world in the future, then it's totally in line with what you're saying, Alan.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And I think outside of eschatology in the past and the present and the future and stuff like that, I think one of the other important questions that we need to ask is, which I think is profound in the way that we approach these situations, is how do I look like the person that I call my enemy? And if we can be objective enough to find similarities, then that's going to push us towards change and a way that we can look at things in a different way. Because if we can't see ourselves in something, it's much easier to dismiss it and act violently against it.
Well said.
Yep.
So our final question comes from Mia from Facebook. And this is an interesting one. I think this is something that not a lot of people are talking about, but there is a story about the French cartoonists that were the victims of the previous terrorist attack in Paris. Yeah. And so her question is, what are your thoughts on the French cartoonists asking people to stop praying for Paris? In situations like this, are there some forms of compassion or empathy inferior to others?
And so there's a post by a cartoonist that says, quote, "Friends from the whole world, thank you for hashtag pray for Paris, but we don't need more religion, exclamation mark. Our faith goes to music, kisses, life, champagne, and joy. Paris is about life. Joanne Sfar."
I want to say that it seems like a lot of rhetoric I hear in the U.S. is around Europe is like, oh, those godless post-Christian humanists, you know, around from the U.S. to Europe. That's kind of what I've heard a lot of.
Yeah.
Like we have kind of a self-superiority that we've like maintained religion in the U.S. and like Europe has lost it or lost their way or something like that. And I think it's really important to recognize what this French artist is saying is like, that they have a civil religion. They might not call it religion, but their way of life and their conceptions of what's ultimate and what's real are just as valid as ours. Like just as valid as those people claiming religious rhetoric. And actually, there's kind of an amazing strength in that, because I think to resist religion in the sense of what this person is doing is to resist the claims and the toolkit that allow people to co-opt it for violent means. So when they're saying like, we don't need more religion, I read that as they're saying religion has become a set of tools and ideas that allow people to make it whatever they want, and people with violent intentions can use religion to horrifying degrees, you know? And so I don't think it's necessarily like an attack on religion for this person to exclaim that they don't want that, you know? Like I think a lot of people can read that as...
I think that they are interpreting... I know, it can be read this way. They read
different ways. Yeah.
Cartoonist is saying religion itself has caused this violence. And as a person of faith, I kind of like come back at that and say, hey, please don't assume terrorists have the same sort of religion that I do, right? Even Christian ones or Muslim ones or whatever. Fundamentalists don't have the religion that I do. But you're right. There is also this concept of, what's the word? Not patronizing. A patronizing concept of praying for Paris. Or did you see the memes? This is a really good question for Mia. Are there some forms of compassion that are better than others? I think the memes that show like, you know, the Statue of Liberty is wading through the Pacific Ocean holding an M16 above her head. Have you seen that? And she's like, don't worry, we're coming for you, Paris. Or like even worse, Uncle Sam is cradling the Statue of Liberty because the Statue of Liberty was French. And so the Statue of Liberty's crying and she's weak, and Uncle Sam is like super buff and he's like consoling her. I think there's I think there are forms of compassion that stroke our ego as Americans or help us, that vault our own exceptionalism, as opposed to like, whether it's good or not, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, Paris itself built 2 towers above the Eiffel Tower on each side as like a memento to the 2 towers that came down in America. So for their response and their show of solidarity was like building these towers that were physically taller than their big landmark that they're most known for. Our response is this like patronizing kind of like, you need us kind of thing. So I think there are some forms of compassion that are better than others. For me, prayer is not powerless. I think if I believed prayer was powerless, I wouldn't be comforted by the fact that people are praying for me necessarily. Maybe I would be more appropriate for that. But I do believe prayer does things. And so for me, that form of compassion rings true to me. But perhaps that hashtag isn't the support that they need in a society that values life in a different way.
I think at the heart of what this guy's saying, though, is a very Christian ideal. You know, you look at the book of James, or don't just say you're going to pray for someone and then not meet their need. Like the real power of the gospel or the New Testament or the Christian ideology and religion is the fact that we transcend these religious acts into something that's deep and meaningful for the lives of people. And then I feel like this person is talking about extreme expressions of religion, because the other quote that's not circulating as much for obvious reasons is the other quote that this person did after that was lovers of death. And so the first one was addressed to those that are having compassion on Paris for the attacks. And then the second quote is directed towards those who are perpetuating the attacks. And it says, lovers of death, if God exists, he hated you. and you have already lost both on earth and in heaven. So I think that provides a greater context for the type of religion that these quotes are referring to. But I think that the sentiment behind it is very Christian, is very, maybe not religious, but very spiritual.
I want to offer, in addition to that I think there's many different ways to look at prayer. I tend to look at prayer, I mean, I don't really pray, but I tend to look at prayer as like first and foremost a self-alignment of the heart to what is ultimately good and right, you know? Like prayer is, a lot of theologians recently have written, I think Tillich and Moltmann say something to this effect, like prayer is for us. Prayer is to get us in the right place before we act in the world, and it should spur us to act in the world, kind of like what you're saying, Alan. And whether you believe that God metaphysically does something or mystically does something as a result of prayer is up to your theology, I think. But I want to offer Martin Luther King's 4 basic steps to nonviolent action. And he wrote this in his letter from Birmingham jail. 1, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. 2, negotiation. 3, and I think this is what a lot of people conceive of prayer, is self-purification. I think, and 4 is direct action. But the third step, like when we're exhibiting compassion that has not gone through that process of self-purification, said, hey, maybe this cartoon that's being drawn of Uncle Sam comforting, you know,
well
whatever, looks really pompous and self-congratulatory and self-soothing and cathartic to us. Like what is actually doing for the French people? Like, are our motives pure? Are we trying to get rid of hypocrisy? Are we really trying to see things from the other person's perspective? Are we really considering actions that will help and not just make us feel better about ourselves? Like that's prayer. To me, that process is prayer.
Is changing your profile picture serving the French people or serving your need to say that you are not a terrorist? Right?
Well, that's really harsh, though.
That is really
harsh. I don't think it's necessary.
I have to say, personally, when I take certain steps to like show compassion or have a public display of something, sometimes that is in service for my need to separate myself from the evil that I see, just personally,
or just to like look like a good person. Like,
for me, I don't care. It's not about looking like.
But a lot of people do.
I know, but for myself, I want to tell myself that's not me. I am not evil, you know? I am the good. I am on the side of the good. And so I think like that's what I'm telling myself sometimes when I do that. Anyway, there's a lot more to think about than just...
The point of it is to show solidarity, though, right? Like, is there something wrong?
I think it's good. I don't want to say that that's bad. Sorry, that might have come out wrong. But you're right. We need in our compassion, just like Martin Luther King said, to actually go through the process of self-purification, to go through the process of saying, why am I doing what I'm doing, and how is it affecting other people, rather than just immediately reverting to our answers.
And like Mona was saying, like the whole purpose of compassion is directed towards someone else. So the best form of compassion is presented in the best way in which the person we are directing that compassion will receive it. So it's not, it can't be about the way we communicated, the way we think it has to be about the person that's receiving that. So we can say, I did all this stuff and I gave all these, winter jackets to people that were homeless. But if I did it during the summertime, you know what I mean? Like taking into the amount of the context and really like addressing the need itself, what's really going to help is the most important thing.
So then if French people are asking us not to pray for them, so maybe our response can not be continuing to lob prayers at them and express that we're praying for them, but rather to help them reestate their social religion, which is the peace that allows them to make love and babies and drink wine.
Or the hashtag that this
in peace of mind.
The hashtag that Joanne Sfar put forward is hashtag Paris is about life. So like
Paris is about life.
Reaffirming life.
Absolutely. Peace of mind.
But at the same time, we have to also recognize that the cartoonist, he's a minority. I mean, he's not speaking for everyone in Paris, and this is coming from the perspective of an atheist. So this is the way that he receives that. So I mean, it's fine, and that's the problem with just social media in general, is laying a blanket statement over all of Paris. And
that's
when it's general like that. If you're saying pray for Paris, it's different. But if you're talking to that individual person and you're saying, well, no, I'm going to say pray for Paris, then you're defeating the whole purpose. But I think as a blanket statement, the only thing we have is the way that we express that compassion.
Yeah, and it's okay. There are people in Paris that receive that for sure.
But they're trying to tell us that religion has hurt them and they don't want it. Like, I think we have to take it really seriously.
That is true.
But they aren't. He is. And maybe he represents a certain voice. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the difficulty of it.
this group, whoever he represents. But
Yes.
I think that we have to take that seriously. You're right. I shouldn't generalize. But also, I think, to me, there's an implicit statement in that, is that a lot of times when we pray, we feel like we've accomplished something and we don't continue to act.
Yeah.
And so prayer can be really, really problematic and actually hinder real action that makes a difference. And I think that we have to consider that in
and
our
that's
notions
why
of.
in almost all of my prayer is as like a minister, as somebody who does public prayer for a living, I always pair my prayer with and use me and use us. Like whatever we're asking for, God work that out through us in some way. And not that we are important, not that it, like I said before, builds up our ego or our sense of exclusion or whatever. Praying and me and use me reminds me that, like, if God wants to change the world, what better way to do it than through human beings? You know what I mean? That we're putting ourselves at
There's no
disposal
other way
for that.
There's no other way for
In your conception.
In
You're
my
right.
conception, no, but really, human action is necessary.
Yeah,
For,
I would say it's
and we've also
ultimately
created these
primary.
problems.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say it's ultimate and primary in causality and stuff like that, because that's how God has set up the universe in my conception of religion. But I do make room for God and divine action and that kind of thing. But that's a really complicated argument. But all that to say, I agree and support your point, and that's prayer sometimes is a mask for feeling better and not really doing anything. That's sometimes what it becomes.
And we can pray ourselves into a war, and then we've completely, again, missed the point of this cartoonist.
That's true.
Paris, we've done it in the past.
Yeah.
This cartoonist is trying to express that Paris is life, that for a group of people who've just been attacked, their highest conception of the ultimate is life itself. And anything that violates that is actually kind of violating their social religion, even though they're not talking about it that way. But it's not like American Christians have this enlightened, better notion because they believe in a concept of God, and these poor godless Parisians are asking them not to pray because they're dumb. Like we have to really think deeply about those kinds of messages, is all I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. That's a really good question, Mia. Jeez.
Yeah, it really was a great question.
I think before we close out and do our takeaways, I just want to put the information out there first, because I really don't want to close on send us your feedback at irenicast.com/feedback. But if you would like to continue the conversation, you can go to the Facebook post that we already have at facebook.com/irenicast and continue and even answer some of these questions directly, or you can comment on the show notes at irenicast.com/37. And for any questions, comments, or concerns about the show in general, you can always go to irenicast.com/feedback. So I struggle with the best way to close out a conversation like this, but maybe we should just start with kind of our personal takeaways and leave it at that.
We didn't really talk about this, but the thing of selective outrage, how we've talked about Paris, but not Beirut and Baghdad. Everybody changed their profile of Paris, but nobody did for these countries that have been dealing with terrorism on the very same day. I think that, like, for me personally, there's some good psychological reasons for that. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't beat yourself up too much. There is research that says we can only really show empathy toward 150 to maybe 200 people in our lives at one time, because it's just hard for the human brain to conceive of other people outside of its own tribe. In response to selective outrage, just let that be a reminder to us when we get upset about Paris, but not Beirut, that we are conceiving of other people as others. And there is something fundamentally in the human brain that we have to work against if we're going to build a global society that values all human life and not just some. So that's part of my takeaway. But the second thing I would say is go watch Russell Brand's The Solution to Terrorism that he has put out on a YouTube video. He looks crazy. I think he looks nuts or whatever, but he has a really good point. And his point is that there are people, including us, who benefit from the war on terror. It supports our media. It supports our government. And if you don't believe that, just watch what viewership does when terrorism happens. Watch how our government looks when it responds in a strong way to terrorism. And we have to recognize the violence in us before we can solve any problems. So his last words will be mine, and that is, yes, some people, some terrorists who are doing horrible things, they say that they love death more than we love life. And the only way to fight that is to love life and value life more than they will ever value death.
That's really good, Alan.
It's not mine, but it is really good.
Right, but thanks for bringing that to us.
Absolutely.
I'd like to draw attention to a book by Mark Juergensmeyer, Mark Juergensmeyer, excuse me, called Terror in the Mind of God. This was written about 10 years ago, but this book asks these questions. It seeks to understand the odd attraction of religion and violence. And I, as a religious and theological scholar, I think it's important for all of us to be able to see how violent people are using religion, not how violent religion necessitates violence. Like, let's be insightful enough and see nuance enough to be able to distinguish the two and call them different things, to see that religion becomes a tool in the hands of violent people rather than the other way around. And I think for me, reflecting back on Christianity, my own tradition, it seems to me that it's really becomes implicit that we have notions of Christianity that weaken the ability for violent people to co-opt it, that we teach people to hold our faith loosely and not have these absolute claims and absolute concepts of faith that are inherently violent and divisive, but that seek to reconcile and seek to build peace. So if we preach gospels of that, it's less likely that people can use the Christian God in the name of terror. And I think vice versa for other people of other faiths, people of Buddhist traditions and Muslim traditions and neo-pagan traditions and what have you, to really critically examine. And a lot of religious scholars really do work toward this goal. So if you can think of the Religious Scholar Project of like, how have religions traditionally been interpreted and how are they being interpreted today and what are they being used for? To think of religion as a toolkit and also to think about how religion and religious interpretations are primed by political and social realities that are preventable a lot of times. Most times are preventable. Let's be historians. Let's be scholars. Let's look deeply into the issues and not just get our news sources from memes. Let's actually read about this stuff and have something informed to say. Because I think the world deserves that. Like, the world is in crisis.
Yeah.
The world deserves our attention and our minds and our engagement in deep ways. And I'm trying to get better at that too. So that's a call for myself as well.
I think for me, it's scary enough to know that you can be at a concert or in a coffee shop and that anyone can just come in with a gun or a bomb or anything like that. Like, that thought alone is fearful enough. Don't pack on fear with saying it's going to happen to you or we need to do this or else it's going to happen. Like, all this rhetoric that increases that fear tenfold. It doesn't help in the response. It doesn't help people when they're grieving. It doesn't help people who've already been victims of stuff like this. It doesn't help people make rational decisions about how to create peace and love and harmony and all the things that we hopefully are all striving for.
Don't make terrorism worse.
Yeah, I mean, don't feed it with its fuel, which is fear and violence and death.
That's really well said.
Yeah. That, like, we have to ask ourselves, sorry if I can just tack onto that. When terrorist acts are performed, what do they want out of that? What kind of reaction do they want that will fuel their cause? Is another way of saying what you just said, I think, Jeff. Like, yeah. And how can we not give them that reaction?
Exactly. Well, I think that I guess that'll do it for us this week. I know that there's a lot of things to talk about. I know there's a lot of questions, and I know there's a lot of feelings and mixed emotions that people have in regards to stuff like this. And hopefully we have helped provide at least a little bit or a starting point for deeper conversation or more understanding about how things like this happen and how we can prevent them in the long term. And that's kind of our goal in any conversation that we have, is to gain understanding about the person, about the issue, about life, love, liberty, and all that good stuff that comes with it. So hopefully everyone listening has just an amazing week and that you find a way in which you can cope with things like this that come into your life. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.